Welcome back to the 3 in 3, a series where I'll be giving you 3-minute reviews of some horror shit that I've been watching lately. And in resurrecting this series, I figured let's give this installment a theme. So the 3 films that I'm going to be looking at today are all Spanish. In fact, more specifically, they're all Spanish films from a particular era, that era being the 2010s. So, why the 2010s? In fact, why Spanish films even? Well, this goes back to a video that I made at the end of last year, the top 10 Spanish horror films of the last 5 years. A video that I really enjoyed making, in that it gave me an excuse to watch some really good modern Spanish horror films. Because I am of the opinion that Spain has really produced a lot of great horror films in recent years, and it was fun just going back and revisiting some of the weird and wonderful stuff that I'm pretty sure I'd never have come across had I not had the impetus to make that video in the first place. Therefore, that gave me an idea, which is to start working my way back through Spain's horror output for the purposes of doing a top 10 of each of the last few decades. And seeing as I started out with the most modern stuff, but also because I'm a fucking idiot, I figured let's do this backwards, by starting off at the 2010s. And for any top 10 video, there's always a lot of grinding that goes on behind the scenes, most of which you'll normally never see. But in this case, the 3 films that I'm going to be looking at today are all films that I've watched as part of that grind. They're all Spanish films of the 2010s that may or may not actually eventually end up on that top 10 of the decade video. Really, it's just down to how good everything else is. But regardless of how they rank, the 3 films that I'm going to be talking about today are all interesting in their own rights for their own reasons. So first up, let's talk about MUSE from 2017, the 9th horror film to be made by its director, Jaume Balaguero, who is one of Spain's most famous 21st century horror directors. Now, MUSE is a really interesting story of witchcraft and ancient supernatural forces that plays out structurally a little bit like maybe a more deadly serious, dark, kind of gloomy version of something like The Ninth Gate, only with a much more pronounced commitment to actually honouring its horror elements. We follow a literature professor who's plagued by nightmares that soon start to become reality. He quickly finds himself thrown together with a mysterious young woman who claims to have been having exactly the same dreams that he has, and then the two of them have got to try and solve the mystery of what is happening to them and why, dredging up dark secrets from their own pasts in the process. Now, this is one of those films that's got this wonderfully dense mythology to it. There's just a ton of fascinatingly intricate lore dredged up at every turn, that gives this film, which is based on a 2003 novel by Spanish writer José Carlos Somoza, the feeling of occupying a thoroughly fleshed out world of supernatural entities and arcane secrets, all whilst you're hurtling along at a steady pace. There's no just standing around and explaining stuff scenes in this film, everything moves, you never lose a sense of what's at stake at any given moment. The story fires along from set piece to set piece, divulging not just the odd plot point each time, but huge chunks of information. There's big revelations, major twists, and impressively complex world building happening pretty much continuously throughout once the plot actually gets up and running. There's just such a great sense of scale to this film all the way through. The stakes in it feel massive, the emotions are big and powerful, the ideas are really well thought out and are genuinely smart and unique, yet are tossed out with such frequency as to make the whole thing just seem matter of fact. Honestly, MUSE I think is just an absolutely brilliant film that's got more going on in it than any dozen plodding, elevated horror, witchcraft bore fests. I think he's only let down very slightly with one particular little subplot that I feel you could probably cut out to no real effect. I think the strip club scenes in it are fairly pointless and add quite an unnecessarily unpleasant diversion that doesn't particularly fit with the feel of the rest of the film. I also think that Franca Potente, who's just one of the most glorious of screen presences, is perhaps somewhat wasted overall. But those minor quibbles aside, MUSE, for me, I'm gonna say is a solid 8.5 out of 10. You know, I think it might even be Jaume Balaguero's best film. Next up is going to be also from 2017/2018, and it is Sadrac González-Perellón's Black Hollow Cage, which was released on DVD in the UK under the somewhat more straightforwardly nondescript title of Dark Portal. Now, personally, I think that the original title is a lot more fitting. In part, this is because it's a story about characters that are being trapped in a metaphorical cage of their own kind of guilt over their past actions, but also because this is a film that is black in that it's often horribly underlit, hollow in terms of having no meaningful substance, and a cage in that the overall experience is of being stuck somewhere that you desperately want to get out of. And plus, it's also a suitably clunkily pretentious combination of words to suggest the art house mess that's to come. So the story itself is really wafer thin. It concerns an isolated family dealing with grief and loss as a pair of sinister children turn up at their door with disruptive intentions. There's this central low-key kind of time travel mechanic at the core of this film that's fairly interesting, but mainly what you get for the majority of the running time is just long, icy, sterile scenes of a bunch of really kind of awkwardly mannequinish non-entities wandering about this fancily designed building, occasionally waking up enough to scream at each other histrionically, or for a random burst of low enthusiasm violence. I know a lot of modern horror fans enthuse over slow burns, but this is a film that takes that to a whole different level. It's decided right from the very start to set its style to patience-taxingly minimalist, and it never once deviates from that. When you finally do get to the end, all that you've really got to show for your time is just such a tiny, slight little sci-fi idea that you really just can't justify the amount of time that it took you to get there. In fact, if I can cryptically spoil that end for you, what it is it's basically a riff on the sonic screwdriver bit from Day of the Doctor, but spread out over a glacial 100 minutes and full of loathsome, aggravatingly pretentious bad actors in a daze. I think you could realistically cut this film down to about 10 minutes, so minuscule is the amount of time that's actually needed to tell this story. And unfortunately, even the journey itself offers nothing but just absolute tedium. I guess we should be grateful for small mercies in that there's very little dialogue overall, because the actual dialogue that we do get is fucking dreadful.
My father liked the colour blue. His favourite actor was Tom Hanks. She loved Paris. And dogs.
Okay, I can't listen to any more of this because it's making me sick, so bye.
So, I'm gonna come in at a 3 out of 10 for Black Hollow Cage, even though I guess in terms of just pure enjoyment, it's probably not even a 3, but I'll give it a 3 for a one-time watch and then say that there's really absolutely zero reason that I think you'd ever have for wanting to rewatch this contemptuously pompous waste of time ever again. So, to round things off, we'll be sticking in 2017 for a thriller/horror effort from another Spanish genre legend, which is a film called The Bar, from director Alex de la Iglesia, this being his 6th horror film. It's a film that uses that old group of characters stuck in a single location trope that I think is always an interesting one. It's the kind of setup that really demands top-notch writing, where you're stuck with just dialogue and character interactions in a confined space, and it's always entertaining to see those kind of films pulled off well. And without spoiling exactly what kind of a film The Bar ultimately is, I think it's the sort of film that you could really spoil by talking about significant plot developments. Our disparate group of characters we're cooped up with here are all regulars at a little coffee bar in the city, who, on one day like any other, find themselves trapped inside when somebody is shot right on their doorstep. And then when they go out to help him, they soon realise that there's a shooter outside waiting to pick off anyone that leaves the building. Now, it's a decently tense setup, and all the way throughout the film, there's a kind of ambiguity about exactly what it is that the threat is that our group's facing. Because, of course, the real baddie in this scenario, which I suppose might be kind of a spoiler, is ultimately human nature itself. I can say that The Bar is not a zombie film, but it basically replicates those familiar interpersonal conflicts and backstabbings and paranoia that you would typically associate with your average kind of Night of the Living Dead-esque zombie film. Unfortunately, that does mean that there's a certain degree of predictability. I think for a film like that to work, your characters all really have to be consistently scummy. They have to exemplify the very worst traits of humanity at every turn, and with that comes a certain mechanical feeling to a lot of the key beats. The fact that a lot of the big twists feel not just contrived, but that by the second half, like they're just there to pad out the running time, I think is also unfortunate. As is the constant need to have at least one character in the group act as the easily demonisable baddie at any given moment, which I think really seems to work against the usual thesis of a film like this, which is that when the chips are down, it's everyone for themselves, and that we're all capable of doing terrible things in a terrible situation. Oddly, there's also this persistent streak of black comedy that runs throughout the film, which might have been there initially to kind of alleviate the bleakness, but which ends up feeling somewhat misplaced and rather kind of self-defeating. For me, The Bar is by no means Alex Iglesias' best work, but it is an interesting little chamber piece with some solid performances and some decent tension, largely I think in the first half, before it then kind of peters out somewhat with an ending that's kind of bafflingly underwhelming. So overall, I can't really rate The Bar any higher than a 6 out of 10. It is above average, but it's also unsatisfying and shapeless in that it really kind of lacks a particularly compelling or well-constructed plot for its characters to move through. There is, though, some spectacularly well-justified by plot mechanics gratuitous nudity, though, if that's the kind of plot that you're interested in.
Sounds good to me. Enjoy.
So, that's going to wrap up this edition of the 3 in 3. Thanks for joining me for this little bit of the Spanish grind, and hopefully we'll see you back here soon for some more horror bullshit. See you then.